The evening air was thick and warm, the kind that makes your shirt stick to your back even before you do anything. He was just driving home. His hands, familiar and relaxed on the steering wheel, still carried the faint ache of a good day's work, not from lifting anything heavy, but from the gentle, persistent pressure of guitar strings. He was a music teacher, and the final, resonant chord of the after-school jam session still seemed to hang in the air around him, mixing with the low hum of his car's engine. He was thinking about the kids, about the shy bass player who'd finally played a solo without looking at his feet, about the stack of permission slips for the upcoming spring concert still unsigned on his desk. His mind was miles away from the speedometer, wrapped in the pleasant fatigue that comes from doing something you love. The road home was a straight shot, a route he'd driven 1,000 times. The fading light painted everything in long, golden shadows. The flash in his mirror was so sudden, so bright, it felt like a physical slap. His heart, which had been beating a slow, contented rhythm, instantly kicked into a frantic sprint. Red and blue lights splashed across his windshield, painting the interior of his car in urgent, swirling colors. "Okay," he said out loud to nobody. The word was just a puff of air. He signaled carefully and guided the car onto the wide gravel shoulder. The crunch of stones under his tires was a loud, final sound. He put the car in park, killed the engine, and the silence that followed was somehow louder than the music in his head had been. His instructions came from somewhere deep, from a script every person like him knows by heart. Hands on the wheel, 10 and 2. Don't make any sudden moves. Be calm. Be clear. He watched in the side mirror as the officer's door opened. He saw the heavy boots hit the ground, the straight line of the uniform, the deliberate pace as the man approached. The officer's face was set in neutral lines, showing nothing. He looked tired, like a man at the end of a long shift. The knock on the window was firm. The teacher rolled it down, the mechanical whirring sound strangely intimate. "License and registration, please." His voice was steady. He said, "Yes, sir," as he moved slowly, telling the officer where his glove compartment was before he reached over to open it. His fingers found the documents, smooth and familiar. He handed them over. The officer took them, his eyes scanning the interior of the car in quick professional flicks. Textbooks on the back seat, a thermos of tea in the cup holder, a fleece jacket bundled on the passenger seat. "You know why I pulled you over?" "I'm not sure, officer." "You were going 42 in a 35. He nodded. He hadn't realized. He'd been floating on the memory of the music. "I'm sorry about that. I was just thinking about work. I didn't mean to speed." The officer gave a small, non-committal grunt, looking at the license, then back at him. The silence stretched. It was the kind of silence that fills up with things unsaid. The teacher kept his hands on the wheel. "Where are you headed?" "Home. I'm a teacher. Just finished up with an after-school program." Another grunt. The officer handed back the license and registration. For a second, the teacher felt a wash of relief. Maybe this would just be a warning. Maybe he could still get home in time to call his sister like he'd promised. Then the officer spoke again, his tone shifting, becoming just a fraction harder. "You mind if I take a look inside your vehicle?" The question hung in the air. The teacher knew this question. He knew his rights. He'd had the conversation with his father, with his friends, in low, serious voices. He took a quiet breath. "I'd prefer not, officer. I'm just trying to get home." The officer's expression didn't change, but something around his eyes did. A tightening. A flicker of something that wasn't boredom anymore. "Step out of the car for me." The request was flat, an order disguised as civility. The teacher's stomach tightened into a cold knot. "Am I being detained, officer? Am I under arrest?" "Step out of the car, now." The voice had lost all its professional neutrality. It was pure command. The teacher felt the world narrowing. The walls of his car, which had felt like a safe shell a moment ago, now felt like a trap. His mind raced. He knew he hadn't done anything. He knew there was nothing to find. But he also knew how this could go. He thought of the kids at school, their faces trusting and open. He did not reach for the door handle. Instead, he kept his hands visible, high on the wheel. His voice, when he found it again, was calm but firm. It was the voice he used to settle a rowdy classroom. "Officer, I do not consent to a search. I have not done anything wrong. I'd like to be on my way, please." What happened next seemed to unfold in terrible, slow motion. The officer's face, previously just stern, flushed a dark red. His lips pressed into a white line. The professional mask shattered, revealing a raw, unfiltered anger beneath it. "I said, get out." The teacher opened his mouth to speak, to repeat his refusal, to try and find the magic words that would de-escalate this. But the officer didn't wait for words. The officer's right hand, clenched into a tight fist, pulled back and then shot forward. It wasn't a knock. It wasn't a tap. It was a full, powerful, violent punch aimed directly at the driver's side window. The sound was unbelievable. It wasn't a crash. It was a brutal, explosive POP, like a gunshot followed by a waterfall of shattering crystal. A spiderweb of cracks erupted from the point of impact. And then the entire window gave way, collapsing inward in a glittering, terrifying cascade. The teacher flinched violently, throwing his arms up over his face. 1,000 tiny diamonds of safety glass rained down on him, covering his lap, his arms catching in his hair. The shock was so complete, so physical, it stole the air from his lungs. He sat frozen, feeling the sharp, surprising bite of little pieces against his skin. The world outside, framed now by jagged teeth of glass, looked surreal, distorted. The officer was breathing heavily, his fist unhurt, protected by the heavy leather of his glove. He leaned into the new, gaping hole where the window had been. His voice was a guttural roar, filled with a rage that had nothing to do with a 7-mile-per-hour speeding ticket. Out of the car. Now, trembling, the teacher moved like a man in a dream. He fumbled for the door handle, his fingers slippery and clumsy. He pushed the door open, glass tinkling to the gravel. As he stood on unsteady legs, he felt the cool evening air on his skin, a shocking contrast to the heat of his own panic. He saw the other cars whizzing by on the road, their drivers staring, then quickly looking away. "Turn around." "Hands on the roof." He complied, the rough, sun-warmed metal of his car roof gritty under his palms. He was patted down, the officer's hands rough and efficient. He was pulled back, his arms bent behind him, and the cold, hard metal of handcuffs was snapped around his wrists. The click was a final, dreadful sound dot as he was led to the back of the squad car. He glanced back at his own vehicle. It sat there, wounded, the gaping hole in the window looking like a scream. The evening sun glinted off 1,000,000 pieces of scattered glass on the driver's seat, turning them into a cruel, beautiful spectacle. He was guided into the hard plastic back seat, the door thudding shut with a sound of absolute finality. He sat there, alone. The adrenaline began to recede, leaving a deep, trembling cold in its place. He looked at his hands, cuffed in his lap. He saw a few small, bright red lines on his forearm where the glass had cut him. The despair was a heavy blanket, smothering him. This was the story he knew, the one he'd always hoped would never be his. A simple drive home, a broken window, a ride in the back of a police car, and then he remembered. His phone. He'd placed it in the cup holder when he got in the car after school, wanting to be disconnected for the drive. He'd opened his voice memo app almost without thinking when the lights first flashed, a habit born of too many cautionary tailies. He'd forgotten about it completely during the storm of anger and shattering glass dot. It was still there, sitting in that cup holder, buried under a fine layer of glass dust, its little red recording light silently blinking away in the wreckage. The inside of the police car smelled like old coffee, stale sweat, and industrial cleaner. It was a small, hard plastic world. He sat in the middle of the back seat, his hands cuffed behind him, the metal biting into his wrists if he shifted even a little. He could only look straight ahead, through the thick, scratched plexiglass that separated him from the front. He watched the officer get into the driver's seat. The man didn't look back. He just got on his radio, his voice flat and professional again, like a switch had been flipped. 10:15. One in custody. Non-compliant subject. Had to use controlled force to gain compliance. The words were like a slap. Asterisk non-compliant. Controlled force. Asterisk, they painted a picture of a wild, dangerous person. Not a teacher with guitar-calloused fingers who had said, "I do not consent." He closed his eyes for a second, trying to steady his breathing. Through the window, he saw the other patrol car arrive. Another officer got out. The two men stood by his broken car, talking. The new officer nodded, looking at the shattered window, then glancing back at him in the squad car. He saw them pointing at the glass on the driver's seat. He saw the first officer, the one who had thrown the punch, gesture with his hands, acting out a story. He knew, right then, what the story was. It was a story about fear, about a threat, about doing what was necessary. He was the villain in that story. After a while, the first officer came back and drove him to the station. The ride was silent. The teacher didn't speak. He just watched the familiar streets of his own town slide by, seeing them from this awful, helpless angle. He saw people on the sidewalks, living their normal Tuesday evenings. A woman walking a dog. A couple laughing outside a restaurant. He felt like a ghost, passing through a world he didn't belong to any more. At the station. It was all procedure. It was designed to make you feel small, like a number, like a problem to be processed. They took his fingerprints, the black ink cold and thick on his fingers. They took his photograph. They asked him questions, but they weren't listening to his answers. They were filling in boxes on a form. When he tried to say what really happened, tried to explain about the refusal, about the sudden, shocking violence of the punch, the officer taking his information just held up a hand. "You can tell all that to your lawyer. We have the officer's report here. He was put in a holding cell. It was just a bench and a toilet." The door clanged shut with a sound that echoed in his bones. He sat on the cold bench, his head in his hands. The cuts on his arm stung. His shoulder ached from being cuffed. But those pains were nothing. The real pain was a heavy, cold stone in his chest. It was the feeling of being erased, of having his own story, his own truth, replaced by someone else's lie. He thought about his job. What would the school say? What would the parents of his students think? The word arrest had a smell, a stain that was hard to wash out. Even if it was a lie. Hours later, they released him. The charges were read to him: resisting arrest, obstruction. They gave him a court date. It was just a piece of paper, but it felt like a shackle. A friend came to pick him up, his face tight with worry. They drove in silence back to the impound lot where his car was taken. Seeing it again was a fresh shock. In the harsh yellow light of the lot, the broken window looked even more brutal. The inside was still littered with a fine, glittering dust of glass. His friend helped him sweep out the worst of it with a brush from his trunk. They covered the window with a thick plastic bag and duct tape. It looked pathetic, like a wound hastily bandaged. Driving home like that with the plastic bag rattling and sucking in and out with the wind, was the loneliest feeling in the world. The noise was constant, a reminder with every breath the car took. He got home very late. His apartment was dark and quiet. He didn't turn on the lights. He just stood in the middle of the living room, still smelling like the police station. He felt dirty. He felt broken. He took a long, hot shower, scrubbing at his skin, but the feeling didn't go away. He looked at the small red lines on his arm in the bathroom mirror. He was about to lie down, to try and shut the world out, when a memory jolted through him, sharp and clear. The phone. His breath caught. In the chaos, the shock, the processing, he had completely forgotten about it. He had gotten his belongings back in a clear plastic bag at the station. His wallet, his keys. But not his phone. They hadn't had his phone. It must have still been in the car. He rushed back out to the taped-up car, his heart hammering. He pulled open the door. The interior light came on, illuminating the glittering mess. And there it was, in the cup holder, just as he'd left it, half buried under a sprinkling of glass dust. He picked it up with trembling hands. The screen was fine. He pressed the power button. The battery was low, but it was still on. With a deep breath, he opened the voice memo app. There was a file time-stamped from that afternoon. The length of the recording was over an hour. He pressed play and brought the phone to his ear. First, there was the soft hum of the car engine and the faint sound of the radio he'd been listening to. Then, his own voice calm saying, "Okay," as he pulled over. His heart squeezed. He heard the officer's first words, the request for his license. He heard his own polite, clear responses. He heard the question about the search. And he heard his own voice, steady but firm, saying the words that had started it all. "I'd prefer not, officer. I'm just trying to get home." Then came the officer's voice changing, turning hard. The order to get out. His own repeated refusal. "I do not consent to a search." And then, a pause. A heavy, tense silence on the recording that lasted only 2 seconds, but felt like a lifetime. And then the sound. It was not what he expected. On the recording, without the visual shock, it was even more chilling. It was a terrible, wet crunch pop, a sound of pure, destructive force, followed instantly by the high, crystalline rain of shattered glass. It was so violent, so loud on the audio, it made him flinch again, right there in his driveway. Then came his own gasp, a sharp intake of pure shock. And then the officer's roar, raw and furious. "Get out now." He listened to the rest, the orders, the confusion, the sound of the door opening. Then the recording just continued, picking up muffled sounds from outside the car after he was taken away. Until the battery must have died. He stood there in the quiet night, the phone pressed to his ear, long after the recording had ended. A strange, fierce feeling began to push aside the cold despair. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was more like clarity, like finding a solid piece of ground in a swirling flood. This was the truth. This was the real story, not the report written on a form at the station. This audio was an unedited, undeniable witness. It held the calm before the storm, and the exact moment the storm broke. It held the officer's rage, naked and clear. It held his own humanity, his calm refusal, his shock. He walked back inside, the phone clutched in his hand like a lifeline. He plugged it in to charge. He knew what this was. It was power. It was danger. It was the most important thing he now owned. He didn't know what to do with it yet, but he knew he had to protect it. He connected the phone to his computer and uploaded the audio file to 2 different cloud services. He sent a copy to his own email. He saved it on a hard drive. He made copies of the copies. He wasn't just saving a recording. He was preserving a truth that had almost been destroyed. Then, and only then, did he let himself sit down. He looked at his hands. The same hands that had been cuffed were now holding the key to his own freedom. The night was still dark outside, but the heavy stone in his chest had cracked. A single thin beam of something not quite light, but the absence of total darkness, had gotten in. The fight hadn't even started. But now, for the first time since that fist flew toward his window, he wasn't completely unarmed. He didn't sleep that night. The audio file was a live thing in the room with him, humming with a strange energy. He just sat at his small kitchen table, the computer glowing in the dark, listening to the recording over and over. Not because he wanted to relive it, but because he needed to understand it as evidence. He needed to hear the exact sequence, the tone, the pause. He needed to know the truth so well that no one could twist it. When the sun came up, pale and gray through the window, he felt scraped raw but clear-headed. The first thing he did was call the school. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, too formal. He told the principal he had a family emergency and wouldn't be in. It wasn't a full lie. This was an emergency. His next call was to the public defender's office. The conversation was short and discouraging. The woman on the phone was nice, but sounded overwhelmed. She confirmed his court date and said they would look at the officer's report before then. She used words like standard procedure and likely a plea deal. He tried to tell her about the recording, but she just said, "Bring whatever you have to your court date." He hung up feeling like he was a small piece of paper being filed into a very large, very full cabinet. That's when the fear started to change shape. It wasn't just the fear of what happened anymore. It was the fear that it would stick, that the official story, the report, the charges would become the only story. He imagined his life shrinking, losing his job, the sideways glances, a permanent mark on his record. The recording felt powerful in the quiet of his apartment, but out in the world of procedures and paperwork, would it even matter? He needed someone to hear it. Not a lawyer buried in cases, but someone who would understand the weight of it. He thought of his cousin. His cousin wasn't a lawyer. He worked with a community group, organizing meetings, helping people navigate problems with housing, and sometimes with the police. He was a connector, a person who knew how to get things seen. He drove over to his cousin's house later that morning. The taped plastic over his window billowed and snapped with every turn, a loud, embarrassing announcement of his shame. His cousin came out onto the porch, his face immediately full of concern. They went inside, and over cups of too strong coffee, the teacher told him everything. The traffic stop, the refusal, the punch, the arrest. He didn't embellish. He just told it flat out. His cousin listened, his expression growing darker and harder. When the teacher finished, his cousin said just one word. "Proof?" The teacher took out his phone and played the first part of the recording. He watched his cousin's face. He saw the man's eyes close for a second as the crucial moment approached. He saw him flinch physically at the sound of the window shattering. His cousin's jaw tightened. When the audio finished with the officer's enraged yell, his cousin let out a long, slow breath. "That's it," his cousin said, his voice low and serious. "That's the whole thing. That's the non-compliance." He looked at the teacher. "This can't just go to a public defender. This has to go out. This audio, it's not just your story anymore. It's the story of what they think they can do in the dark and get away with." The cousin made some calls. He spoke in a low, urgent voice to people the teacher didn't know. He mentioned names of local organizers, of a pastor who ran a community center, of a woman who sat on the city council. And he mentioned a reporter, not from a big national paper, but from a local digital news outlet known for digging into city hall and police union contracts. A reporter who had written stories others ignored. A meeting was set for that evening at the community center. It was a small room with fluorescent lights and folding chairs that smelled like old coffee and lemon cleaner. The teacher was nervous. He felt exposed. Sitting around the table were his cousin, the pastor, a calm older man with gentle eyes, the councilwoman, and the reporter. The reporter was younger than he expected, with a sharp, attentive face. She didn't say much at first, just listened as the teacher told his story again. Then she asked to hear the audio. He played it for the room. In the silence of the meeting room, the recording was even more stark, more intimate. He watched their reactions. The pastor bowed his head, a pained look on his face. The councilwoman's lips pressed into a thin line. The reporter didn't move a muscle, just listened, her eyes fixed on the phone as if she could see the scene unfolding. When it ended, the silence was heavy. The reporter was the first to speak. "I need a copy of that file. The raw, original file." Her voice was quiet but direct. "And I need to verify it. I'll need to see your car, get a copy of the police report, talk to the department for comment." This is very clear." She explained her process. She wouldn't just publish the audio. She would build the story around it. She would request the body camera footage if there was any. She would ask the police for their version, for the officer's report. She would get the teacher's account, and then she would let the audio sit at the heart of it all, allowing listeners to decide for themselves. The teacher agreed. He felt a strange relief handing it over to her. It was like sharing a heavy burden. He gave her the file, showed her his car with its pathetic plastic window. She took pictures of everything, the glittering glass still on the seats, the specific pattern of the brake, the cuts on his arm. The next 2 days were a tense blur of waiting. The reporter was working, she said. The police department, when she contacted them, gave a no comment pending internal review. The officer was placed on desk duty. It was a standard move, but it felt like the first tremor. Then, as story dropped out, it appeared online late one evening. The headline was straightforward, but the subheading cut to the bone. The article laid out the facts simply: the stop, the request for a search, the refusal. It quoted the police department's no comment. And then, embedded in the middle of the text, was the audio player. The caption read, "Listen to the traffic stop," and the moment the window was shattered. The teacher sat alone in his apartment and watched the website. He saw the view count on the article start to climb. Dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. He refreshed the page, and the numbers kept jumping. Comments started pouring in, a flood of anger, shock, and support. Then it spread. Someone shared it on a larger social media platform. A popular community activist with many followers retweeted it with the words, "This is what non-compliance sounds like." That was the match. The story exploded. By morning, it was everywhere. Local TV news stations were picking it up, playing snippets of the audio on the air. The police department's phones, the article said, were ringing off the hook. The city council announced they were looking into the matter. The teacher's own phone began to buzz with messages from friends he hadn't spoken to in years, from colleagues at school offering quiet support, from unknown numbers with words of encouragement. He didn't leave his apartment. The world outside felt too loud, too charged. He watched the news on his laptop, seeing his own shattered car window on the screen, hearing his own voice, edited and packaged for broadcast. It was surreal. He wasn't a person anymore. He was a story, a symbol. He saw the planned protest announced for outside the police headquarters that weekend. People were angry, and his recording was the proof that fed their anger. He thought about the officer. The man who had been just a uniform, a burst of rage, was now also a story. His name was in the articles. His photograph from the police website was being shared online. The teacher looked at that photo, a stern, ordinary face, and felt a complicated twist in his gut. This wasn't just about one man's anger anymore. It was about a system, a pattern, a truth being exposed. The audio had done that. It had taken a private, terrifying moment of injustice and held it up to the public ear. The power had shifted. He could feel it. The city was braced for a storm. And he, sitting in his quiet apartment, was the quiet, unlikely eye of it. He had started with a simple, polite refusal. Now, the whole city could hear what that refusal had cost him, and the whole city was listening to the terrible price, captured in the brutal, crystal-clear sound of shattering glass. For the officer, the world went quiet first. He was told not to report to patrol, but to an administrative office in a different part of the building. His gun and his badge were taken, not as punishment, they said, but pending the outcome. He was given a small, windowless room with a desk and a computer. His job was to review old case files, to cross-check paperwork. It was make work. It was exile. The silence in that room was different from the silence in his patrol car. That had been a quiet of waiting, of control. This was the silence of being shut away. He could hear the faint buzz of the fluorescent light, the distant sound of phones ringing in other offices, the muffled voices of a world moving on without him. He avoided the break room. He brought his own coffee in a thermos. He knew the looks he would get. Not anger, not yet from his colleagues. Something worse. Discomfort, avoidance, a careful neutrality. The blue wall wasn't a solid thing you could lean on. It was made of people, and people got nervous. When the story was just a report, it was easy. You backed your brother officer. But when the story had a sound, a clear, ugly, undeniable sound that anyone could listen to on their phone, the calculus changed. A few of the older guys clapped him on the shoulder, said, "Hang in there, it'll blow over," but their eyes didn't meet his. The younger ones just looked through him. He went home, and the quiet there was worse. His wife moved around the kitchen, cooking dinner, but she didn't ask him about his day. She asked if he'd heard from the union rep. Her questions were practical, logistical. They were about benefits, about procedure. They were not about it, about what he had done. The explosion came from his youngest. His teenage son was at the kitchen table, his school laptop open. He was a good kid, quiet, thinking about college for engineering. He looked up as his father came in, and there was none of the usual easy grin. "Dad," the boy said. His voice was flat. "I heard it." The officer stopped, his hand on the back of a chair. "Heard what?" "The audio. Everyone at school was talking about it. I found it." The boy turned the laptop around. On the screen was the news article. The play button was right there, a little triangle over a waveform that looked like a violent mountain peak. The officer felt his face grow hot. "You shouldn't be looking at that garbage. It's edited. It's not the whole story. Just play it," his wife said quietly from the sink. She wasn't looking at him either. She was staring out the window at the backyard. "Play it for us. Tell us the whole story." He couldn't. He stood there, frozen. The demand hung in the air. He saw the confusion and the dawning hurt in his son's eyes. This was his father, the man who coached his little league team, who taught him to change a tire. And now he was a meme, a news clip, a voice on a recording roaring with rage. "I was dealing with a non-compliant subject," he started, the official words dry in his mouth. He was refusing a lawful order. It was a tense situation. You don't understand the pressure. His son just shook his head, a slow, disappointed movement. He just said no. "Dad," he said he didn't consent. "You can hear it. And then you just..." The boy couldn't finish. He closed the laptop with a sharp click. He got up and walked out of the room. The sound of his bedroom door closing upstairs was softer than the slam of a patrol car door, but it hit the officer just as hard. That night, lying stiffly beside his sleeping wife, he finally let himself listen. Not to the news clip, but to the memory. He closed his eyes in the dark and tried to replay it honestly. Not as he had written it in the report, but as it had happened. He saw the car, clean, ordinary. He saw the man inside, hands on the wheel. Not a kid, not some known troublemaker from the usual spots. A man his own age, maybe. He heard the man's voice again, polite, clear. "I'd prefer not, officer." It wasn't belligerent. It was firm. It was a man who knew his rights. And in that moment, in the humid evening air, that firmness had felt like a challenge. It had scraped against a raw nerve he didn't even know was exposed. Why? The question echoed in the dark. Was it because he was tired? Sure, his shift was long. Was it because he'd had a run of bad calls earlier? Maybe, but as he lay there, the real ugly answer surfaced, one he had never had to articulate before. It was because that calm, polite refusal, coming from that man in that car, had flipped a switch in him. A switch labeled control. A switch wired with assumptions he'd absorbed over 20 years on the job. Assumptions about who gets to say no and who has to listen. The man's calmness had felt like disrespect. His lawfulness had felt like defiance. And then he saw his own fist. Not a tool of measured force, but an act of pure, unfiltered frustration. He saw the window explode. He heard the gasp of shock, a human sound of pure fear. He had created that fear, not to stop a threat, but to punish a refusal. The guilt didn't wash over him. It assembled inside him, piece by heavy piece. It was the weight of his son's disappointed face. It was the silence of his wife. It was the empty desk in the windowless room. It was the knowledge that every person in the city who heard that recording heard him, not officer so-and-so, but the man beneath the uniform, and they heard a bully. They heard the very thing he had told himself for 2 decades that he was not. He thought about the teacher. He looked him up in the file. He saw his photograph, his job. He imagined him sweeping glass out of his car. He imagined him listening to that recording in the dark. Alone, the way he was now lying in the dark. Alone. For the first time, the man he had arrested became a real person to him. Not a subject, not a violator. A man who taught kids music. A man who had gone home that night with pieces of his car window in his hair, and a terror in his heart that he, the officer, had put there, the official process ground on. The union lawyer was confident. We argued the stop was good. The search request was lawful. His refusal created a safety concern. The force was about gaining immediate compliance to secure the scene. It's a training issue, not a criminal one. We'll get you back on patrol. The words were empty noise. They were a script for a play that had already ended. The officer started waking up before dawn, his mind already replaying the crunch-pop sound. He saw it on the faces of people at the gas station when he went out in plain clothes. A flicker of recognition, then a quick look away. He was a ghost in his own life. The weight in his chest grew heavier. It was the weight of a truth he could no longer outrun. The story wasn't in the news cycle anymore. It was inside his own house, in the space between him and his family. The badge had been a shield for a long time, protecting him from having to see certain things about himself. That shield was gone now, shattered as completely as the car window. All that was left was the man who had thrown the punch, and the echoing, devastating silence that followed. He knew, with a cold certainty, that no internal investigation, no union defense, could fix what was broken. He had done more than break a window. He had broken a trust the public's, his family's, and his own. and he had no idea if the pieces could ever be gathered up, or if he would just be left standing forever in a shower of his own making. The city, wanting to make the whole thing go away, offered a settlement. It was a number on a piece of paper, followed by a lot of zeros. In exchange, the charges against him would be formally dropped, and he would agree not to sue. His lawyer, a calm woman hired by the community group after the story broke, explained it to him. She said it was a good deal. It was an admission of wrongdoing without them having to say the words. It was closure, of a sort. He listened. He looked at the number. It felt like blood money. It felt like being paid to be silent, to let them sweep the broken glass under a very expensive rug. He knew he would take it to clear his name, to protect his job, to pay for the repairs and the legal fees. But it left a hollow feeling. It was a business transaction. It wasn't the truth. Then a different offer came. Through the same community mediator, a woman who worked with the city and the pastor from the community center. She asked if he would be willing to meet with the officer. A private, facilitated conversation. Restorative justice, she called it. It wasn't about punishment or money. It was about him having a chance to say what this had done to him, and for the officer to listen. Maybe even to speak. His first instinct was a hard no. The thought of being in the same room with that man made his skin crawl. He could still feel the spray of glass. He could still hear the roar in his ear. Why should he give that man a minute more of his life? What good would it do? He talked to his cousin about it. His cousin said, "Don't do it for him. Do it for you. You've been heard by the city, by the news, by the public. But he hasn't heard you. Not really. And you've never had to look him in the eye." That got to him. The power of the recording was that it had forced the world to see him as a human being. But the officer had never seen him that way, not even for a second. Maybe looking him in the eye was the final piece. Not for forgiveness, but for reclaiming his own humanity completely. He agreed. The meeting was in a small, plain room at the community center. There was a round table, a box of tissues, a water pitcher. The mediator was there, a woman with a gentle voice and a calm presence. The teacher got there first. He sat, his hands clenched together on the table. His heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. Then the door opened. The officer walked in. He looked different. Out of uniform, in jeans and a plain button-down shirt, he looked smaller, older. He looked like a man who hadn't been sleeping. His face was pale, etched with deep lines of stress. He didn't look angry. He looked emptied out. He nodded at the mediator, then his eyes flicked to the teacher. For a second, their gazes locked. The teacher saw no defiance there, only a deep, weary shame. They sat across from each other. The mediator explained the rules. Speak for yourself. Listen without interrupting. This is about understanding, not debate. She looked at the teacher. Would you like to begin? He had thought about what he might say. He'd rehearsed angry speeches, full of pointed questions. But now, with the man right there, all that fell away. He just started from the beginning, in a quiet voice. "I was just driving home," he said. "I was thinking about my students. I was tired in a good way. When you pulled me over, I was nervous, but I wanted to be respectful. I gave you my things. When you asked to search my car, I said no. It wasn't to challenge you. It was because it's my right. It's my car." He paused, watching the officer's face. The man was looking down at his own hands, listening intently. "When you told me to get out, and I said no again, I was scared. But I thought if I just stayed calm, if I just said the right thing, it would be okay. I thought the law was on my side." His voice thickened. "And then, your fist came out of nowhere. The sound, I can still hear it. I felt the glass on my skin. I couldn't breathe. I thought, this is it. This is how it ends for me. On the side of the road for nothing. He described the rest. The cuffing, the ride, the cold bench in the cell. The terror that his life was over. The shame of the plastic bag taped over his window. The fear that everyone would believe the lie. You made me feel like I wasn't a person, he said, his voice barely above a whisper now. You turned me into a problem you had to smash. And for what? Because I said no? He finished. The room was silent, except for the hum of the air conditioner. The officer hadn't moved. The mediator turned to him. Would you like to respond? The officer took a long, shaky breath. He didn't speak right away. He seemed to be gathering words from a deep, painful place. Everything you just said, he began, his voice rough and unused. It's true. All of it. He finally looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. I have listened to that recording 100 times. More. I hear your voice. I hear how calm you were. And I hear my voice. I hear what I became. He swallowed hard. I have no excuse. For 20 years, I told myself I was a good cop, that I helped people, that I knew right from wrong. He shook his head slowly. That day, I was tired, yeah, but that's not why. I was angry because you said no. And from where I was standing in that uniform, with that badge, I didn't think you got to say no to me. Not like that. And that feeling, that's the poison. That's what I let in. That's what I became. He looked directly at the teacher, and the raw pain in his expression was startling. I was wrong. It wasn't controlled force. It was rage. It was me losing control. It was. It was racist. The word hung in the air, heavy and awful. He didn't flinch from it. I didn't see a man exercising a right. I saw a challenge to my authority. And that is a failure in me. Not in the job, in me. He looked down at his hands again, as if they were foreign objects. I broke your window. But I broke a lot more than that. I broke the trust my son had in me. I broke the peace in my own home. I broke the oath I took. I have to live with that. Every day, I have to live with the sound of that glass and know I am the one who caused it. Then he did something the teacher never expected. He pushed his chair back. It made a soft scraping sound on the floor. He stood up. He stepped slowly away from the table. And then, slowly, deliberately, he lowered himself to his knees on the floor. It wasn't a dramatic fall. It was a heavy, defeated collapse. He knelt there, in the middle of the plane room. His shoulders slumped. He looked up at the teacher, and tears were now cutting clean lines down his face. His voice broke completely. What I did was wrong. It was cruel. It was hateful. I am so sorry. There is no excuse. I am so sorry. The silence in the room was absolute. The teacher's breath caught. This wasn't a performance. This wasn't for the news or the city council. This was a man, stripped bare of every shield, the uniform, the badge, the tough guy act crumbling under the weight of his own actions. The apology wasn't asking for anything. It was just a true thing, finally said out loud. The teacher felt a storm of emotions, anger, sadness, a strange, aching pity. He did not feel like a victor. He did not feel like he had won. He just felt the immense, tragic weight of the moment. He did not get up. He did not go to the officer. He did not say, I forgive you. That was not his job. That debt was not owed to him, and it was too large for any one person to cancel. He simply looked at the man on his knees, and he gave a slow, single nod. It wasn't acceptance. It wasn't absolution. It was an acknowledgement. Asterisk, I see you. I hear you. The truth is finally in the room. Asterisk after a long minute, the officer, moving like an old man, pulled himself back into his chair. He wiped his face with his hands. Exhausted. The mediator spoke softly about next steps, about the officer's resignation which she knew was coming, about the ongoing work he would have to do. The teacher barely heard her. He was fixed on the raw human truth of what had just happened. When they left separately. There was no handshake, no more words. The teacher walked out into the afternoon light. It felt different on his skin. The heavy stone that had been in his chest since the night of the broken window was gone. In its place was a hollow space, a quiet exhaustion, but also a sense of solid ground. It wasn't a happy ending. There was no perfect justice. There was just one man who had been shattered and another who had shattered him, both sitting in the wreckage. But for the first time, they were both seeing the same pieces. And for the teacher, that was enough. It was the beginning of his own repair, not because the other man had knelt, but because he had finally, after all the noise and the headlines, been heard. Really heard. And in that silence after the apology, he found his own voice again, whole, and his own.